Hey everybody, it's Mark. Before we get into today's episode, where my guest Gary Marts and I discuss The Department of Truth, Volume 1, I wanted to take just a moment to let you know that this episode was recorded on Tuesday evening of last week, a little less than 24 hours before we learned the news of the latest national tragedy that took place with the school shooting at Appalachia High School in Winder, Georgia. The third issue of the Department of Truth deals with the aftermath of the school shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown, Connecticut, and some of the ghastly conspiracy theories that rose up around the victims of that school shooting and their families in the years that follow. So due to the gap in time between when we recorded this episode, when that tragic school shooting in Winder, Georgia occurred, and the release of today's episode, there obviously won't be any discussion of what happened in Winder, Georgia when we get to issue 3, and so I wanted to drop this note to add that as an explanation for what might seem very unusual when you get to that part of the podcast. Also, to the people of Winder, Georgia, and the community that's connected with the high school there, I just wanted to add my love and my heartbreak for you among the chorus of voices from around the country that have been wishing their very best to the people of that community. It is heartbreaking that our cultural and political values are so misaligned that we've created the conditions where this happens over and over and over again. And I'm hopeful that a time will come where that won't be the case. But for now, to the people of Winder, Georgia, and to the people whose lives have been impacted by school shootings all over the country, I just wanted to add that my heart goes out to you. With that, I hope that you enjoyed today's episode of the Graphic Novel Apostle podcast. I think we had a very good discussion about a really excellent graphic novel, and I thank you for listening.
Once a month, when the moon reaches its highest point in the sky and the wild creatures call out to the night, he emerges from a private sanctuary in an undisclosed location outside of Little Rock, Arkansas, arrayed in his priestly vestments, carrying forth the good news that comic books and graphic novels aren't just for kids, that they aren't just mass and spandex superheroes, that storytelling in a graphic format can be so much more. He is the Graphic Novel Apostle.
Hello, and welcome back to the Graphic Novel Apostle podcast. I'm your host, Mark Ohrenberger, and I am happy to be with you as always this Monday morning. I am very excited for today's episode. I've got my friend Gary Marts with me here today. Gary, how are you, man?
Good. How are you doing?
Good. Well, I'm so happy for you to be here with me today. We are going to talk about a book that I love. It's one of the first ones that I really started to consume heavily when I got into comics just a few years ago and figured out that there is this wide world of non-superhero, non-Marvel DC comics that can be so different from what we think of when we think of comic books. I had read a book, and we'll talk about it more later in the podcast, by this same author, James Tynion IV, called Something is Killing the Children. And at that time, there were about 15 issues out, and I just consumed it. And then I'd heard that he had also done this book called Department of Truth that we're going to talk about today. And I was like, oh, get me in. And by the end of issue 1, I was like, okay, this is a keeper. This is a book that I'm going to be on for a long time. And I'm so happy I picked it up. And we'll talk in a bit, but there are a lot of reasons, too, why I have thought this would be a really good book to do, particularly with you. But for our listeners out there, let me first just go through the credits on this book a little bit. The writer, as I mentioned a moment ago, is James Tynion IV. Art is done by Martin Simmonds. Letters by Aditya Bidikar. And it was published by Image Comics. Now, Department of Truth is still ongoing. It's a book that sometimes takes a bit of a hiatus between volumes, and so it's in the 20s. I think we're coming up on issue 25 coming out next month. But we are going to be speaking today just about Volume 1, which is Department of Truth, issues 1 through 5. They came out between September of 2020 and January of 2021, and the name for this particular volume is The End of the World, and the reason for that name is going to become clear very quickly. So I often forget to do this anymore when we go into these podcasts, but I want to present a spoiler warning right here and now, because this is the kind of book that to really get into it and talk about it, you've got to spoil some stuff. And I think that's going to be okay, but if it's a book that you think you want to read ahead of time, let me encourage you to stop before we even get into issue 1, because it gets twisty very fast. So a lot of time to set up a book, I'll read either the solicit that the publisher puts out or the blurb that's written on the back of the book. I actually want to read a bit of dialogue delivered by the director of the Department of Truth toward the end of issue 1 that I think really puts into perspective what this book exactly is. And it's a little bit of a longer quote, but here it is. I'm going to tell you the secret. The big secret that you've known your entire life. The more people believe in something, the more true that thing becomes. The more reality tips in the favor of that belief. What happened in Antarctica was that a group of men managed to make enough people believe in the truth of a flat Earth to manifest it in reality. If they had been able to bring proof of that back to America and spread it, the world would change. The moon landing would be a hoax. Every government, every airline, every communications corporation, they all would have been in on it from the beginning. Retroactively, the Earth would always have been flat, and the people would rightly rise up in fury, having been lied to by everyone for decades. That is why this organization exists. We have spent the last century making sure that conspiracy theories stay conspiracy theories. And now, you get to be part of it. Lucky you. And lucky us, because we're going to be talking about the Department of Truth. Gary, are you ready to be in? You gonna pledge?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. The first thing that comes to mind for me, though, is like you say the director of the Department of Truth, and I want you, who is it? I want you to,
well, and we'll talk about
identify him.
We'll talk about who that is. I didn't want to identify him too early, though. So before we get into the story of this book, I want to ask you about your impressions generally. And let me say this. You don't have much of a history of reading comics or graphic novels, do you?
None. I probably looked at some comic books when I was a kid. I can't remember ever looking at them as an adult. And I've never read a graphic novel before this. So this is, it's a pretty new experience for me.
Well, cool. Did you enjoy it?
I did. I thought it was interesting. I think conspiracy theories and conspiracy theorizing are very stupid.
Okay.
But at the same time, they do make for tremendous entertainment. And so, this was interesting and entertaining. And there's a lot of good sort of conspiracy theory stuff out there, movies like The Parallax View, which is one of my favorites, and JFK and stuff like that, so it's interesting stuff. I mean, most of the conspiracy theorizing is just completely insane, but again, entertaining.
Well, for sure. And, I know that you're somebody who is well-read on U.S. history, somebody who has a curious mind, someone who's always kind of looking for more information about stuff. I know you've read up on things like the JFK assassination. Over the years, we've talked about some different books about different events like this that become the center points for some conspiracies. We hadn't really talked about how we know each other. It occurred to me just sometime over the weekend that later this week, my law license in Arkansas will turn 19 years old. And you're 1 year ahead of me. So it's been about the same time, probably 20 years ago.
That's exactly right.
You and I first got to know each other when I was a first-year lawyer, fresh out of law school, and you and I were practicing in the same firm where you're still a partner. I've gone on to about 4 different jobs there since. But over the years, and even after I left that firm and went literally directly across the street to the state attorney general's office, the first, 10 years of my career, you and I probably ate lunch like 3 days a week together.
Oh, yeah, sometimes more.
Oh, often more. Yeah, that's right. You and me and our friend Jonathan Horton, who I so desperately want to have on this podcast.
He's the perfect podcast guest.
Oh.
I can't deliver what he could deliver.
Well, and I've got a book picked out for him, too, that I think suits him just right. But then a couple of other different guys over the years, and I hope they won't be upset if we don't talk about who's been in and who's been out. Although your brother Lee, I couldn't go without naming him, certainly. So we've had lots and lots of conversations over the years about books, about history, about politics, about philosophy. And I thought, in the odd form of conspiracy theories, those things all sort of find a way of weaving themselves into this book we're going to talk about here. But really, before we get into it much more, I also want to ask you what you thought of the art in this book.
I thought it was really interesting. Some of the stuff in here is actually, I'm not sure how to describe it, beautiful. I think there's some 2-page spreads, and I apologize if I'm not using the correct technical terminology for it. But
you should apologize.
But some of these are just really lovely. There's one early in the book here that I'm looking at. It's where he's going to the end of the world, and there's this shot of a plane flying. And it's very beautifully rendered. I thought. The colors are really pretty, and it's kind of abstracted a little bit, and just really, I thought, really cool stuff in there. And then aside from that stuff, the way some of the stuff is presented in terms of it's very disjointed, intentionally so because of the subject matter. I mean, it matches the conspiracy theorizing. A lot of the stuff looks like it came out of some weird dossier. I thought that was a really interesting way to present this.
So I don't know all the technical delineations between different art styles like my friend Hannah, who was on a couple of weeks ago, but when I look at Martin Simmonds' art, I usually would describe it to somebody as Impressionism or something very akin to what we think of as Impressionism, or what I think of as Impressionism anyway. And I don't love that necessarily. The artists that I like most deal in more of a realism kind of style. And for comic book people who are listening out there, I've said before, Jacob Phillips is my very favorite comic book artist, and there are a couple others, Simon Kodransky, Jacob Phillips' dad, Sean Phillips, who do some of this very, like, almost photorealistic work that I am most drawn to. And so when I first picked up Department of Truth, it took me a couple of issues to get, at the time I would have said to get past the art. I would have said I didn't like it. And as I got more into the story, I realized this style is the only style that would work for this story.
Yeah, because, I mean, something that was very realistic looking, I don't think it would work, because this stuff is supposed to be shadowy and smoke and mirrors. Is this stuff real? What am I actually seeing here? And the way that it's presented, I think really is maybe one of the only ways you could present it. I don't think you could do it in a very sort of hyper-realistic way, because it would undercut the notion that there's a lot going on here that's sort of below the surface that is difficult to ascertain, stuff that's hidden, stuff that the way it's presented, I think, often kind of calls into question the source of the material that you're looking at. What is this? Am I looking at surveillance video of some sort? Is this, what am I seeing? And at times, there are couple places where you see the same thing through two different lenses. You see the presentation of a character, and then you see that somebody's watching that character on video, on some sort of hidden camera. Yeah, I thought that stuff is really interesting.
Well, and if Martin Simmonds ever does listen to my podcast, please know it just took me a couple of issues to get past that, to get to the point where I realized, I really do like this. It's not the style that I gravitate to for my own tastes.
Well, I think he should like me better because I liked it immediately.
Fair enough. Fair. You win, Gary, once again. Winning hearts and minds all over the world. But something else on the reread of this volume that I did to get ready for this podcast, it was the first time I realized, too, that so often when I am reading comics, because I'm a words guy to begin with, and I think you and I are both words people. I mean, we kind of, they're our stock in trade as lawyers. That takes precedence for me. And so becoming a comic reader has sort of taught me to really focus more on the art and pay attention to it. And I usually spend quite a bit of time looking at the art. And I realized for this book, James Tynion is an absolute pro as a writer. His narrative style is perfect. This would work in a lot of ways super well as prose. But when you add the art, and you add it in this way where I don't think you're meant to dwell on each of the frames. I think because everything is obscured, there are very few clear images in the entire book, that it's supposed to give you more the impression, I guess to go back to the idea of Impressionism, or the feeling of what is happening, and you're supposed to kind of be unsure. And so...
disoriented.
Yeah, disorienting. And it drives you back into the textual narrative as well. And so I think these creators complement each other just super well here.
From my standpoint, I read a lot. I read a lot of novels. So I read this and I kind of find myself at times wanting more exposition, more sort of discursive content, more explanation of what the characters are thinking and what they're doing. And I think it's probably something you have to learn from reading this sort of stuff to be able to kind of incorporate the text and the images together to try to sort of arrive and sort of create some of that stuff as you read it, that if you were reading a novel, there would be some explanation for it. You would have some sort of, you might have dialogue that's a little more extensive than what you have here, or you might have sort of omniscient narrator who's telling you what's going on. And you don't really have that here. So you're having to sort of piece it together, and you have to kind of piece it together from the text and the images, which is probably, people who read this sort of stuff all the time saying, duh, obviously. but for me, I think, as a novice to this, I think it was coming to that understanding, I think was helpful. And I think looking through it a second time, I think I picked up on some stuff I missed the first time.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's cool. I made kind of a hard pivot a few years ago into graphic novels. And before that, I'd been a reader. I don't know that I've ever been a reader quite to the level that you are. I used to pretty much always have a book going, but I know you plow through them a lot faster than I do. I just love story so much, and I've found where you don't have all that exposition, while you lose some of the beauty of the language that you get in some of the longer prose-type books, the efficiency of storytelling is really something that I enjoy, because I'm like, I can consume more stories this way. Well, what do you say we go ahead and get into the text itself?
Sounds good.
Issue 1, and each of these issues, there are 5 in this volume, each of them has its own issue title. And so issue 1 bears the same title as the volume itself, The End of the World. And in the first couple of issues, we get a cold open that relates to the main story being told, but in a way that's not obvious at first, I suppose. And so in this cold open, we open with this 12-panel grid that is extremely obscured. We will figure out from context pretty quickly that the individual we're looking at who's being interrogated is Lee Harvey Oswald, and he's being interrogated about the Kennedy assassination. And while this is going on, 2 men in dark suits come in and they just clear out the room. And once they're actually gone, Oswald seems to sort of let his defenses down a little bit, and it seems like there's some familiarity, and we don't know who these men in the dark suits are exactly. And as they start asking Oswald about what happened, and he's more forthcoming with them, he starts to realize that he is a little unsure himself of exactly what it was that happened. And the guys in black tell him that they're going to make sure that Oswald and everybody else understands that what's going to happen next is what they say. And they tell Oswald, now say it. Say it so I know you still remember. Say it so I know you know the truth. And Oswald responds, up is down and down is up. And that's the end of our cold open. And it's like, what? And from that, we get kind of a title page that tells us we're in chapter 1, the end of the world. So the rest of this issue is set in the present day. And most of it is told in flashback with someone else being interrogated, a younger man who we're going to learn is FBI agent Cole Turner. And he's being interrogated by 2 people, by an older man and by a younger woman. And they're government agents of some kind. It's pretty clear, but we don't know exactly who they're with or what they do. They're probably not FBI because, Turner doesn't seem to relate to them as people from his same agency. And we get a little background on who Cole Turner is. He teaches at Quantico, where he also researches far right-wing extremist online movements and conspiracy theories as well. So this is his area of study and expertise. And it turns out he had actually gone, I guess as sort of a research mission, maybe a little for his own curiosity, to this flat earth convention. And he had gone not as a panelist or a moderator. He had just gone as a guest, another person who buys a ticket. And he's sort of recording his observations, and he's telling the people who are interrogating him now about what he observed there. One of the things that was really wild, though, is he goes to the regular conventions, and it's people with their nutty scientific theories about flat Earth, and I don't know. You ever look into the flat Earth kind of conspiracies, Gary? Oh yeah.
It's they're so funny because so much of the stuff is just the silliest stuff, that just seems so easily refuted and obviously refuted by just things that all of us know, like the fact that we have photographs of the Earth,
but do we, Gary?
And that you can actually observe the curvature of the Earth yourself from an airplane. But those sorts of things.
But they have science.
Yeah, they got something. I kind of liked when he's describing these people who attended there. There's some line like there were so many polo shirts,
right?
And and it immediately is kind of evocative of the kind of people you would expect to see there, and and it kind of brings it home to these are fairly ordinary people like you might see in your office or someplace else. Polo shirts, khakis.
They just happen to believe something that's cuckoo.
They just believe something that is just wildly nuts. And, it talks about too the fact that they walk around with this belief that they know a secret truth about the world, that they know it, but other people don't know it, and everything to the contrary is just part of the conspiracy.
That's right. And this is sort of a fun introduction to the idea of what Cole Turner's world looks like, the types of things that he's studying on a regular basis.
Can we talk about Cole Turner for a second?
Yeah, please.
Because this is one aspect of the visual part of the book that I cannot stand, is I can't stand the way that Cole Turner looks.
Tell me why.
Because he looks like Andy Warhol. He's got this sort of blonde mop top haircut, and he's got these glasses, and frequently when he's shown, the glasses are very prominent, and sometimes with like sort of a glare on them, and all I could think of is that he looks like Andy Warhol.
Oh, that's so funny, because I actually had somebody else that I thought Cole Turner kind of looks like. There are certain angles where they show Turner from that I think he looks a little bit like Robert Redford in some of the, like, and I wish I could pull to my mind what movie it was now. He did a movie later in his career where he worked in like the White House or something like that, and he was involved with, trying to like destroy some records, and it even kind of towed the line a little bit with government conspiracy kind of stuff. Oh, I wish, and so it reminded me of him from that movie.
Well, and of course, Redford was in All the President's Men, which is one of the great conspiracy movies of the 70s that happens to be about a real conspiracy.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So after a day of just wandering around at this Flat Earth conspiracy convention, Cole Turner is just trying to go back to his room and turn in for the night. And somebody stops him in the hallway. And it turns out that somebody who's involved in organizing this convention knows who he is, knows that he's somebody who researches in this area, knows that he works for the FBI. And he ends up getting invited, Cole does, to this exclusive after party, I guess, where these two oil billionaire brothers are showing, I guess, a more elite group of like convention guests a secret film that they have. They say it's actually from Stanley Kubrick's personal library. And this is the film that proves definitively that the moon landing was faked. And I loved watching this scene play out in the book, because as Turner is narrating what happens, he's like, and then suddenly the camera shifts because it was from a different angle, and it shows a man standing off screen with no like space helmet or anything like that, and he's holding a cardboard cup of coffee, and it says like the men in the room just were elated, and they all just start bursting out in cheers of, yet another conspiracy proven to be true. And it is all men. That's something that Cole actually explicitly notes. He said it's all men, all white, who are part of this, not at the convention, but who are at this like after party, except for one woman. She's in this bright red dress, and she's one of the few things that I'll say really stands out among the art that is more obscured. She's a more defined figure throughout the book. But she's wearing this bright red dress and a red headscarf, and she's got these dark glasses that she's wearing all the time. And she makes Cole uneasy immediately. And so I guess he can't really put his finger on why, but there's something about her that is off. So after this adventure, I guess, with that party, those billionaires come back over to Cole and they say, hey, we're going to take a little field trip and we want you to come too. And so I guess it's this group of these elite guests who all end up boarding this private plane owned by the billionaires, and they're going to go off to some unknown destination. And it turns out they're flying to Antarctica, to what the billionaires will say is the end of the map. And you described this double-page spread earlier that we get where the plane is flying and suddenly Turner is looking out the window and he sees this giant ice wall that just goes straight up, apparently proving to all of these cheering men who are getting drunk on the private plane that their flat earth conspiracies were right, and they can see that with their own eyes. So the plane lands and they all get out and they're standing there on the tarmac, and suddenly there's another woman among the group, and somebody's asking them like, oh, are you with the staff, or who are you here with? And she says she's not. And then somebody says, wait, are you with Black Hat? And she says, no, I'm not with them either. And then she pulls out something that looks like a machine gun to me, some kind of assault rifle or whatever. And she just mows down everybody who's on the tarmac except Cole Turner. I want to back up 1 second, though. I skipped over a page, and listeners of this show will know usually we try and put some samples of the art up on our Instagram account at Graphic Novel Apostle. And one of the pages I will include is this one I'm going to talk about now, where they're still on the airplane, and that woman in the red dress looks over at Turner, And she, as they're approaching this ice wall, and she says, "Did you see?" And then she pulls down these dark glasses, and we see beneath them for the first time. And she has these black X's over her eyes. And she follows up and she says, "It's important that you see." And we're going to come back to that a time or two. But there really is something weird going on with this woman. So to go back out to our tarmac again for just a second, this other woman, not the woman in the red dress, has mowed down all of these people and killed them. And Cole Turner is naturally just totally freaking out. We'll find out later her name is Ruby. She's one of the two people who's interrogating Cole. And she says, "Agent Turner, we're here to take you home." And so to kind of flash back to earlier in this issue, we see Cole Turner in this car, and Ruby's driving him to where he's going to be interrogated. And he's got blood on his suit, and the whole time he's asking her, like, "Are you going to kill me?" He is very concerned that she's going to kill him. And she keeps trying to tell him, like, probably not. Although I suppose that's not real reassuring.
I think it's a reasonable question to ask after you've seen somebody kill like 50 people or something. I might have the same question. Of course, she should have killed him at the scene rather than taking him back to wherever they went to. So, but yeah, reasonable thought that maybe she's going to kill you too.
I'm not going to say you're wrong. So as we wrap up the last few pages of the issue, and we've heard Turner tell his story now, the older man who's an interrogator explains a little bit about the nature of reality. And that goes back to that quote that I read earlier about the nature of reality and conspiracy, how if enough people believe something, it manifests. If enough people believe something, it becomes true. And he tells Turner that you don't work for the FBI anymore. You've been poached. You work for us now. And he doesn't really say exactly who they are. And Turner is exasperated. He is freaked out. He's probably exhausted. And he says to the man, "Look, I still don't even know who you people are." And that's when we turn and we get this last page reveal. You've got this big seal on the wall that says Department of Truth, United States of America, and it's got that seeing eye inside the pyramid.
The all-seeing eye.
I beg your pardon, the all-seeing eye from the back of the dollar bill.
Yeah.
And he just stands there and he says, "My name is Lee Harvey Oswald. Welcome to the Department of Truth." And when I read that for the first time, that's when I was like, okay, this is going to become one of my very favorite comic book series. I'm so excited for this.
It definitely piques your interest and makes you want to read further. You see that, like, okay. There's some other stuff in there that kind of piques your interest, like who is this lady in the red dress and what's up with her eyes. But the Lee Harvey Oswald thing is, because he's such an important kind of foundational character in conspiracy theorizing at least in the contemporary United States, because he's such a central figure in the JFK assassination, which is the sort of central text of conspiracy theorists.
It's the OG.
Yeah, and so to have that tied back to Lee Harvey Oswald's not dead. Jack Ruby didn't kill him. Here he is. 50, 60 years later, he's turns out he's actually still operating under the same name, and he's operating a secret government agency. You're like, okay, I'll read. I want to read further. I want to find out what's up with Lee Harvey Oswald.
You were in. I'm glad to hear that. And it's kind of my tradition to try and not talk too much to my guests before they come on the show about whether they liked the book or didn't like the book. But one thing I knew was that I had loaned you my copy of just Volume 1, so the trade paperback of those first 5 issues. And you sent me a text and said that you had gone online, purchased the deluxe hardcover.
I did, yeah.
That had the whole first 3 volumes.
Yeah, I haven't read them yet, but I definitely have them, and we'll look at them at some point. I got to the end of this, and I wanted to know more about what's going on.
Oh, cool, yeah.
Part of it was my questions, like what's going on with Lee Harvey Oswald, not really answered here in this the first 5 chapters or whatever they are. We see him a few more times, but we don't get a whole lot of information about like how the hell is he here?
Yeah, true. Tynion has been slow to reveal that over the course of the series. And man, it's been a while since I've read volumes 2, 3, and 4. And so I was actually kind of hoping that you would be able to fill me in a little bit because I didn't have time to go back and reread all of those. And
I had good intentions, but I did not get to reading the rest of it.
Hey, fair enough. Well, let's go in and talk about issue number 2 as we get there. And issue 2 is called Devils Real and Imagined. And we get another one of these cold opens. It's Cole Turner, and he's a 4-year-old boy. And he's apparently under some kind of hypnotism. and he's being questioned about something that he saw, something he refers to as the star-faced man, and that his teacher had somehow let the star-faced man in. The star-faced man was eating a baby and telling Cole not to talk about it, threatening that the devil knows and he'd find Cole if he talked to anybody about this. And Cole is in just like a straight-up panic, as you would expect any 4-year-old would be, and he's saying, I want to wake up. I don't want to talk about this anymore. And that's the end of our cold open. And then we go back into the present day. So this is going to be the issue where we spend quite a bit of time talking about the satanic panic of the 1980s. Gary, you're a couple of years older than me. Even though I guess it would be about the age of Cole Turner, I think, in this book, I don't have a real strong memory of like satanic panic news stories. I remember, hearing from friends at school, like, if you play this Led Zeppelin album backwards, and I couldn't ever figure out how you would do something like that, or this Black Sabbath album, if you play it backwards, it's got some message from the devil on it or something like that. And I actually remember watching this public access television show one time, and there was one of these conspiracy theory guys who had his very own public access local television show. And so I guess this was a dude who lived in my community. And I remember him like, I don't know how I got onto this, but it kind of freaked me out, frankly, as like a 10-year-old, watching him as he was breaking down the lyrics to Stairway to Heaven, which I just loved at the time. And he was like explaining how this is all devil messages and stuff. And I was like, oh no, but I love Stairway to Heaven. But do you have a better memory of this?
That's the thing, is the way that it's presented in the book is that it was some sort of a major thing and some sort of satanic panic, that people across the country were in the throes of some sort of hysteria over this. I don't have any recollection of that. Entirely possible that maybe I'm just not old enough to have a real recollection of it, but I have a pretty good recollection of stuff that happened in the news when I was pretty young. It's actually a weird thing about me, that I have weird recollections of news stories from when I was a kid.
You remember Baby Jessica, don't you?
Oh, absolutely. Well, I was like 12 or 13 when that happened. I have weird recollections of stuff that happened when I was like 3 or 4. I don't remember much about the satanic panic stuff, other than like what you were talking about, those sorts of things, like certain albums played backwards would, cause you to give your life over to Satan and all that sort of thing. But I don't recall this being sort of an all-encompassing panic like it's presented in the book. And it actually made it a little bit difficult for me to kind of get into that as a primary plot point. But I guess you kind of have to just sort of suspend your disbelief a little bit and sort of take it at face value that it was a big deal. And, and I think later on it's suggested that that was made up, and that I don't have a lot of any knowledge about that, but it's obviously a very formative experience for Cole.
Well, and I feel like it is taken in popular culture now, in fiction, like satanic panic was really something that was gripping the nation at the time. Actually just last month, my favorite comic book duo, Ed Brubaker and Sean Phillips, came out with a book called Houses of the Unholy, which, exact same thing. They went back to the 1980s to this like devil cult, and that was sort of the setting and the basis for that graphic novel that they released. I feel like in horror movies I see that a lot too, like that's something that's played on. Maybe it was more prevalent than we realized, but my memory is not that it was.
Or maybe it was just prevalent in certain places around the country or something. I didn't go and research it after I read this. But yeah, I don't recall it being a huge deal, at least not here in Little Rock where I grew up.
Well, Gary, maybe you're just a godless heathen and you didn't take it seriously
That may be entirely possible. Maybe I was one of the people conspiring and engaging in it when I was like 5 years old.
You would say that this wasn't real. In fact, I mean, were you in a devil cult of some kind?
I don't want to talk about it right now. That's private stuff, and it's really not for the podcast.
I beg your pardon. We'll talk off air. Don't worry, listeners. I can add something after we go off. Hey, something else I wanted to point out, some of the art, just like in the very opening pages of this as well, so much of what we're dealing with in this book is the mix of political ideas, government, and what aren't we being told, and are these figures that we see in government evil? And there's this page that's got and I think this was a variant cover for issue 2, but it's all these pictures of Ronald Reagan, and he's just in a suit and he's smiling, except it's colored over with red, and like devil horns and teeth are drawn on him and everything. It suits the tone of the book so well.
Yeah, I think it's sort of an interesting aspect to this, and I think something about conspiracy theorizing that it occurs to me more and more. When in that first part, when we first meet Cole Turner, we find out that his job at the FBI is monitoring sort of right-wing conspiracy theory stuff. He tracks people online. And you think of so much of this stuff now as being sort of the preserve of a certain kind of right-winger. But a lot of the conspiracy theory stuff is stuff that I think 20, 25 years ago you would have associated with people on the left. And some of this stuff is crossed over, like sort of the obsession with deep states and all that sort of stuff. I mean, some in the obsession with the Kennedy assassination and the CIA being involved in it, you think of more, back in the old days, you sort of thought of as the preserve of kind of left-wing people. And now it's sort of bled over, and it's not really easy to tell like what the political valence of that is with any particular person. Are they right wing? Are they left wing? They're definitely a lunatic, but I'm not sure which variety.
Which one?
I can't tell which stripe they are.
I guess there's a point where the circle comes all the way back around.
The horseshoe theory, I think, is a real thing. That you go so far around the bend, you end up meeting the lunatics from whatever the opposite side was from where you started.
And they never play nice when they all get together.
No.
So going back into the present, which is what we get after the title page of this book in that cold open, Cole is an adult now, obviously, where we've met him before, and he's thinking back to his youth and that star-faced man of his childhood during the Satanic Panic. So it turns out that Cole was actually a witness, or I guess at the time he would have been thought of as a victim in some regionally famous Satanic Panic case, where, like under hypnosis, which kind of what we saw in the cold open, he fed back to some sort of lawyer and a psychologist or something like that, some story about, his teacher and this star-faced man eating a baby. But as an adult, he thinks that he knows intellectually that the things that he testified about as a kid never actually happened. But there's still something inside of him that it feels real. And it's kind of something you get the sense has like spooked him a little bit over his life. But now that he's discovered that reality is pliable, now he has some real questions about his star-faced man. And he wants to know if this guy is real and if he's still out.
What happened to him isn't entirely clear, but he definitely sees himself, I think, as a victim. You can only kind of describe his response to it as sort of a trauma response. I mean, he's traumatized by this, and it clearly is something that remains upsetting to him 20, 30 years later, however long this is after that. It clearly is something that is still driving him, trying to figure out what happened, trying to assimilate what happened and understand. And like he said, I think he's got some concern now. Well, wait a second. If this sort of stuff can just manifest, is that what happened with me?
Yeah. And by the way, when I sort of question the idea of him being a victim as a child, I'm not meaning to cast aspersions on him and say that no good lying 4-year-old.
Well,
what I mean, though, is at the time, he was thought to have been a victim of exposure to the devil. And the eating of babies.
It's still real to him, damn it.
Gary, thank you. And I'm the professional wrestling guy. Not you. Thank you for taking me back to the greatest professional wrestling meme of all time.
Before we move on, while I enjoyed this book, and I mentioned earlier my issues with Cole sort of looking like Andy Warhol, I think maybe a more important issue for me is I don't really like him much as a character. He sort of seems in some ways there isn't much depth to him, and there's some effort here to give him some depth. We see him in a domestic situation with his husband, a guy named Matt, who's a proofreader at a newspaper called The Post, who we will see other employees from The Post later on. And Matt's mad at Cole because Cole disappeared for a few days without explanation when he was on his little journey to the edge of the world. And, they don't really resolve that, but you see, okay, well, he's got this domestic situation. At the same time, I still don't feel like, other than, we know Cole's got this situation with the Satanic Panic. He saw the star-faced man eating a baby. He's upset about it. He's got a nagging husband. Other than that, there isn't a lot there, and I wanted to know more about him.
Oh, that's interesting. And, I hadn't considered that because I'm thinking of him. It doesn't really matter to me what the rest of his life is or what it looks like, because where we are meeting him is at this moment of utter confusion and panic. And I thought you were going to say one of the issues that you had with Cole Turner is that he's weak, in that he sees these things that he knows are terrible, but in his pursuit of answers for what happened to him as a child, he's willing to sort of be pushed around by Lee Harvey Oswald and the Department of Truth.
He is frequently more acted upon than he is acting, I think is definitely true.
And he allows that.
Yeah, to some degree. And that doesn't bother me so much because, like I said, I think that's one of those things. It could be setting up something later that eventually there'll be some point at which he will stand up for himself.
Sure.
But I did want to, to sort of understand his psychology a little bit more and a little bit more about a character. And I don't know how you necessarily unpack those things in a graphic novel. If this were a novel, you could do that in lots of different ways. But and I think you make a good point too, that we do know he is in a very turmoil laden situation here. He's been shown that some of this stuff that he thought was just conspiracy fantasizing it can manifest itself. He's seen the end of the world. He saw a bunch of people get murdered. He thinks that this lady who murdered all those people might want to murder him. He just learned that Lee Harvey Oswald is still lurking around running a government agency
that he's never heard of.
Right. That's all. Yeah, you can kind of see where he'd be a little overwhelmed by all that. But
it's an understatement of the year.
I guess at the same time that I still wanted to know more about him. Like what's up with this guy? What motivates him ordinarily? Like what
are his likes and dislikes?
Yeah.
What does he listen to on the radio?
Yeah, I need him to do like the Proust questionnaire. Just tell me what you're up to. Tell me what you like. What do you listen to? Let me know a little bit more about old Cole.
Well, Tynion, if you're listening, whenever you go to make a movie out of this, fix it. All right, so some of this history that we've learned about with Cole, as he's reflecting on it as an adult, is him telling this to Ruby over what looks like a delicious pancake breakfast. She's saying, I understand, that's the question that you really need to have answered. And he's like, that's the only thing that matters to me at this point. And she tells him, well, then it sounds like it's time for you to hit rock bottom. And I love that. So the next thing we see, Ruby is taking Cole into this like sub-basement of the Department of Truth. And she says there are like 12 sub-basements that she knows of. She's not really sure how many there are. But we go through, and this is kind of something like a little bit of a cast of characters broadening that I love. They have a guy down there who's this big sort of slovenly looking guy whose job it is, and is totally jaded by the world and sarcastic. And it's his job just to watch right-wing media all day and prepare reports on what conspiracies that he thinks people might start to believe because of how it's being portrayed in the media. And then we meet a guy literally in a tinfoil hat who keeps the archives. And when we go down and see the archives for the Department of Truth, it's, we've talked on this podcast before about the concept of a murder board or a murder wall, which I always like. But this is like to the extreme. It goes down to the floor. There are papers just scattered everywhere and red string as far as the eye can see. And, at some point he explains how, no, of course we're not digitizing this media. This, that's too ephemeral. It can change at any time. This is the perfect way that archives for the Department of Truth ought to be kept scattered about on floors and walls.
He also thinks you should be wearing a tinfoil hat, too, if you knew what was good for you.
That's right. That's right. Who better for your conspiracy theory fighting organization than a genuine conspiracy theorist? There's also like a Peck, who's basically like a surly teenager. Which is just kind of another, that's pretty stereotypical character too for like your hacker type character, but it's pretty fun. But so while they're down there looking through the archives of the Department of Truth for information about Satanic Panic specifically, so that they can maybe bring a little bit of relief to Cole or some answers, the tinfoil hat guy talks about how he hates when kids get drug into these things because they're so pliable and they're ready to believe. And he kind of makes this reference, and I don't want to go too far into this, but he makes this reference how the Department of Truth occasionally has to kill off Santa every couple of years. But the reason I really wanted to focus on that is I mentioned earlier in the podcast the most well-known series that James Tynion IV writes, which is called Something is Killing the Children. It is awesome. But let me hit you with the premise of this book. And I didn't realize until I'd been reading both of these books for a couple of years that, in a sense, they're the same book. Something is Killing the Children begins with the idea that monsters are real and they manifest in the world only when enough children believe in a strong enough way in the same type of monster. So my campfire story that I tell to you, if you get freaked out by that and you start believing in the monster that I've described in our campfire story, and maybe your little brother does too, and next thing you know, it's kind of going around the elementary school, well, eventually that monster's going to become real. And there's an organization called the Order of St. George, who are these dedicated monster hunters. And by the way, in that world, that book is so cool. In that world, while anybody can see the effects of what these monsters do, they can see a child being killed or an adult being killed. Adults, other than people in this Order of St. George, cannot see the monsters. And so they still think it's children's imaginations just running away with them, and there must be some kind of criminal in our midst. But what is actually happening is that there are monsters that are killing the children. And we have this awesome character named Erica Slaughter, who's a member first, and later kind of breaks away from this Order of St. George, who is a monster hunter. And she's our hero through that book. But, I mean, really, these are based on the same idea.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, from your description, that it's this notion that if enough people believe something, it manifests, that there's some point at which it achieves some sort of critical mass and it becomes real. You have this sort of shadowy entity, I guess, that goes around and takes care of this problem when it happens.
Right.
I'm interested in the Order of St. George. I mean, I guess named after St. George, the Dragon Slayer.
Yes, exactly.
So that's interesting.
What's cool is there's a also very successful spin-off series that Tynion created, but some other writers actually write, from Something is Killing the Children, called House of Slaughter. While Something is Killing the Children really focuses on Erica Slaughter and her adventures, some of the characters that we're introduced to, we explore their universe and this Order of St. George more broadly, and how it has, like locations all over the country and all over the world in this House of Slaughter book that's separate. It is totally cool. I get why both of these books are huge sellers and people love them, but I've never heard anybody, surely I'm not the first person to think of this, I just never heard it pointed to anywhere, that these are basically the same book.
Yeah, that is interesting, because, I mean, when you describe the plot of this other thing, which I haven't seen or know anything about, obviously very similar stories. The sort of prime motivating factor in both stories is kind of the same notion of horribles getting manifested into reality. That's kind of interesting. Where are they different? Where do they sort of depart from one another is probably the next question there.
Well, I love this though, because I love when you can take a story out of its original setting and make it work someplace else. Did you ever watch The Sons of Anarchy?
No, never saw it.
That show was awesome. That's one of the best shows ever to have been on television. And it is, at least through its first couple of seasons, it's Hamlet with an outlaw motorcycle gang. And there was a wrestling comic book series a few years ago. Oh, crud, I cannot bring the name of it to mind right now. Oh, rats, I'll think of it later. But it was telling the story of Macbeth just with Southern wrestling in the 1980s. And it was perfect, and it told the story in a fun way with the same, I guess they're the same sort of like eternal ideas that are brought forth in Shakespeare.
Don't want to hijack this by talking about Shakespeare.
No, hijack.
But yeah, I mean, that's the cool thing about Shakespeare is that, the universality of the stories, the way that they can be taken from whatever context they happen to appear in and can be placed into these different historical settings, but things that motivate people to do what they do remain the same, and they're not, and our motivations are not tremendously different from somebody's motivations from 400 years ago or 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago. I mean, as long as we have recorded recollections of what people do and why they do them, a lot of those motivations often look very familiar to us today. We tend to think of ourselves as being tremendously different from people who have preceded us in the past, but very often those people they may wear weird pants and they may not have a car, but they're doing stuff for some of the same reasons we do it: jealousy, envy, love, lust, anger, all those sorts of things that make us do what we do.
So while we're on the subject of Shakespeare and conspiracy theory, What's up? Shakespeare write all them books?
Oh my God, yes.
And you've got a master's in English.
Not actually a master's degree in English. I did the coursework for a master's degree in English, but left for law school before I took the exams.
I beg your pardon.
But I did study English, and I studied English in graduate school, and my specialty was 17th century English, mostly poetry, particularly the poetry of Alexander Pope. I did a little work in graduate school on Shakespeare, but the notion that Shakespeare didn't write his plays is one of the silliest things that I've ever heard. We have so much historical detail about the fact that there was a guy named William Shakespeare. He was participating in London theater during the period in which these plays were written and produced, and he got wealthy doing it. And we know quite a bit about him. I mean, there's some snobbery behind a lot of that. Okay. Because of the notion that Shakespeare was not a particularly educated person by the standards of the day, especially. He didn't go to Oxford, he didn't go to Cambridge, he didn't have any sort of an education, and there's always been sort of a sneering sort of snobbery that, well, somebody so poorly educated couldn't possibly have written all this incredibly rich literature. Well, it must have been somebody from a better background. It must have been the Earl of Oxford, or it must have been
Christopher Marlowe,
who of course died before Shakespeare wrote most of his most important plays. That's always one of those things, like, it's, in my experience, you can get people who study Shakespeare professionally to various degrees of dismissiveness, from sort of eye-rolling to sort of violent recrimination against anybody who would push this stuff. Although, people take it seriously. I think there was something several years ago where a couple of United States Supreme Court justices actually staged a trial on this issue.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I can't remember exactly how it was done, or exactly whether they were the judges or they were the advocates. I think they were the judges, and people came into court and sort of put on the case, like, this is why Shakespeare didn't write this stuff.
Nerds.
Yeah, a bunch of dorks. And, and I think the Supreme Court justices involved, I want to say it was like Stevens and Ginsburg. So, they're dead now, and you can say horrible, horrible things about what a terrible idea that was.
Would you please?
Oh, yeah. I have no respect for that endeavor on the part of either one of them. But
oh, my goodness. You heard it here, folks. Gary Marts, ardent believer in the truth of William Shakespeare writing those plays.
I'll fight you.
And he will fight you. Hey, by the way, I looked it up while you were going on that rant like you do. And The Crimson Cage was the name of that Macbeth adaptation as Southern Wrastlin' in the Territory days. And it was really a fun series. So to wrap up issue 2, though, which we probably ought to do, while Cole is down in the archives, he finds this picture of the star-faced man on the wall. And it turns out it's from a record that had been created just the prior year of this little girl. And he's reading her testimony. He takes down this document, and her testimony about encountering the star-faced man is remarkably similar to Cole's from when he was a kid. But then she also testifies about this woman in red who has X's over her eyes. And at this point, Cole just falls apart. He freaks out. He starts yelling about how he wants to wake up, sort of like the 4-year-old Cole did at the very beginning of this issue. And that's where we leave off. And it's like, oh man, our man Cole is in a hard place.
He has a definite break there. Should have stayed out of the archive.
So we go now into issue 3, which is called Black and White. Up to this point, we have been talking about what I think is sort of the harmless, or more the silly fun side of conspiracy theories, as we can, laugh about these wacky ideas. This one, though, goes into an area where conspiracy theory really has hurt people in really, really real ways. And so this issue is told largely from the perspective of a mother whose child had died in a school shooting. We learn later that this was something that happened in Connecticut, so obviously we're making very real reference to Sandy Hook here. Newtown, Connecticut, where Sandy Hook took place, is like 30 minutes from my hometown of Milford. And when that occurred, my mom was still teaching in the public high school in Milford. Now, I didn't have friends from Newtown. I had been 15 years moved away or something like that by the time that incident occurred. But, man, even though I didn't know Newtown that well, that's a town just like Milford. And that one always is more upsetting to me, I guess, because it I can relate to it in a deeper way than so many of the school shootings. And not to say, they're all important and significant, but that one I just feel viscerally in a different way. And this issue opens with an Alex Jones type character. He's on his radio show ranting about how these are crisis actors and the shooting didn't happen, and this is all to take people's guns away. At first, when the mother hears this, she says to herself, well, at least that's such a crazy thing. Nobody's going to believe it, even though it is wounding to her. But then, the next thing we know, and we see how this mother's life has been ruined by all these people who are protesting outside of her house. She's had bricks thrown through her window, and people accuse her of being a crisis actor, and her life has just completely fallen apart as a result of this.
I thought, this part of the book is just crushing.
Yeah.
I'm not from Connecticut. I don't have any connection to Sandy Hook, but, my mother taught first grade, and I've worked in schools myself, and I can remember when that happened. It was such a horrifying thing to think of. If you have kids, your first thought is your own kids. And
your son was young when that happened.
he was probably 13 when that happened. But
was he? I thought he was a little younger.
But at the same time, but you think about what if that happens to your kids, and that was really sort of the first, I think, of a rash of school shootings. And that was just so gutting to think of these are very young children. And this character in the story, Mary, her son obviously was very young. And, this sort of showing the effect that all of this, the very pernicious real world effect of these conspiracy theories. Because like you said, these aren't cute little...
this is ghoulish.
This isn't cute little, like, oh, I believe this weird thing. Like, oh, I believe that Paul McCartney died and was replaced by somebody faking Paul McCartney. Completely harmless to think that. And it's fun to go through and catalog the clues and the Beatles songs and all that. But this sort of thing is sick. It's just, this person has suffered the absolute worst thing that you can imagine happening to you. That your child is just slaughtered. And these people push these conspiracy theories, and not just do they push them, they push them into you.
Yes.
And they're pushing them literally through your window on the back of a rock or a brick or whatever. And just torturing this poor woman with this
victimized
stuff.
over and over
again. She has no opportunity to move on with her life. She has no opportunity to try to reconcile herself to what happened and try to reach some point where she can at least try to live the rest of her life, because she's being constantly harassed by the word ghoul you used is exactly right. These ghouls, these sick people who would go out and without any apparent sense of the effect they're having on these people, to not realize that they're doing this to real people with real feelings and torturing this poor woman who's gone through so much already. It's just awful. And this section of this book, to me, chapter 3 is absolutely the best part of this, because this is really affecting stuff, and it really, seeing the effect that it has on this poor woman is just awful. It's really gut wrenching.
Yeah. And this issue or chapter being called Black and White is ironic in that we see the Department of Truth in this issue, or at least I do, one way and then another way. And so you feel like it's, we start out by talking about this awful conspiracy theory and how much it is hurting these people. And you think, well, the Department of Truth is going to make sure that those things don't become real and these people don't be victimized, over and over like this. And so you're like, well, maybe these are the good guys then. And by the end of this issue, you start to feel differently. At least it gets really muddy.
It definitely functions, aside from the fact that, again, it's very affecting, it's very moving to see what happens to this woman. We haven't gotten into the details of that yet, and I'm sure we will, but this does function in a way that kind of sets up almost sort of a fulcrum for seeing the Department of Truth, maybe a little more ambiguously, a little more ambivalently than what we would have looked at it before. Because like you said, you're thinking, okay, well, they're going to fix this for this lady. And I think, as we'll see, they don't really fix it for her.
No, and so let's get to that. And I should say, this same concept is going to be echoed again very loudly in issue 4 in a completely different setting. And maybe even, we say, like, not to put not to put too fine a point on it, maybe putting a very fine point on it in issue 4. But here, the mom finds this envelope on her front door. It's got a picture of a black hat printed on it. You may remember when we first met Ruby, when she was out shooting all those guys on the tarmac, someone had asked her whether she was with Black Hat. And this hasn't really ever been explained to us as what it is, but obviously it's something that is the counterbalance to the Department of Truth. So she finds this envelope with the black hat printed on it, and she picks it up and takes it inside, and it's got a flash drive inside it. And on that flash drive is proof that she actually is a crisis actor. And it's got like video of she and a childlike dummy rehearsing how they were going to go over and say these lines, that are actually just from a script.
She's auditioning.
She's auditioning, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. She talks about how she's gone to these improv acting classes under a fake name and that kind of thing. And so from the, I guess we'll call it evidence, from the video that she reviews, she starts to think, oh no, I've been this ruined shell of myself, and yet maybe I actually am a crisis actor. Am I remembering things the way I thought I remembered them? Have I gotten so deep into this character that maybe I actually am just a crisis actor and forgetting it?
What's really crushing about it is she starts to believe these theories. She starts to believe this stuff. She sees that, and what really compels her to believe it isn't so much that she sees this video of her auditioning for the part of being the aggrieved mother of a school shooting victim. It's the fact that it makes her think, well, if that's true, then he must still be alive.
Yeah.
And that if this stuff is true, if I am participating in this conspiracy and this whole thing was fake, then maybe my son, who is still alive. And we see too in here that she has a tremendous amount of guilt because he called her right before he was killed and left a voicemail message, and she didn't answer. She can't remember exactly why she didn't answer, but she didn't answer. And she has this tremendous amount of guilt. And so buying into the conspiracy theory is a way for her to sort of relieve some of that guilt, because if this was all fake, then he wasn't killed and he must be somewhere. Yeah. And we see that she even goes on to these message boards and she's asking people, like, what happens to these people? Are they ever recovered? Or,
Yeah, and her pain is so deep that she wants the conspiracy theory to be true, in which case she would be a monster for participating in it. But she wants it to be true because it is the only thing that can give her hope.
And she's willing to take whatever the ramifications of participating in something so egregious as helping fake this school shooting, if it just means that her son is alive and well and that she can see him again. And it's absolutely crushing to watch, and I think it's really interesting how they sort of portray her sort of descent into this stuff, and the way that it's shown, and they sort of show how she's like on the message boards and the stuff she's discussing with people on the message boards. You can completely see, even if you're completely in possession of all of your critical faculties, your analytic thinking, all of that sort of stuff, that, yeah, I'd probably do the same thing. I mean, if you had one way to latch on to some hope that your child was still alive, yeah, you might believe some of the most outlandish, crazy things that somebody like Alex Jones could spin up.
Yeah, desperation.
Yeah, because it's the last shred of hope. Mm-hmm. And it's really, like I said, it's really gut-wrenching to see that play out and to understand what happens to this poor woman because of the way that she is victimized by these conspiracy theorists.
Well, if you didn't think the mother had gone through enough up to this point, enter the Department of Truth.
Ah, yes. Little breaking and entering.
Yeah, that's right. A little B&E. So Cole and Ruby sneak into the mom's house while she's sleeping, and they're looking around for any evidence that they can find, and they discover that envelope with the picture of the black hat on it.
And she has the artifact. They refer to it as...
That's right.
The flash drive, the artifact.
And so they know that because this woman has received the artifact from the black hat, she likely is believing the truth of the conspiracy at this point, which makes it more likely to manifest in real life.
Yeah. Well, and also I think the fear, too, that she will reveal herself and that she will confess that she is a crisis actor, that her son was not real, he was not really killed, that she was participating in a hoax. That could really push this into the point where more and more people believe it, then it becomes truth. So they're trying to nip it in the bud before she has a chance to come out publicly and say, here I am, my son was supposedly killed, but it's not true. It was all just a big ruse. And so they've got to stop that before it happens.
Yeah, her belief is not going to make the conspiracy true. Her testimony and her evidence
Right.
will convince people beyond just the vampires that are protesting outside of her house, but actual regular people of the truth of this conspiracy, and then it becomes real. So the Department of Truth has to take some kind of action. But this is where we meet the dirty job of the Department of Truth. The mom wakes up and discovers these two people in her house, and she holds them at gunpoint.
She clubs Ruby over the head with her gun, I think.
She pistol whips her.
Yeah.
And she's holding Cole at gunpoint, I guess. And she's, demanding to know what's going on. She wants to know the truth. She wants to know where her son is. And in the midst of all that, Ruby gains her wits back about her and is able to sneak up behind and put a chokehold or a sleeper hold of some kind. Ruby is able to kind of wrestle this woman back to sleep, but that gives Cole and Ruby the opportunity to destroy all the artifact, all the evidence that she had. And when the mom wakes up, she discovers that all the evidence that she had is gone. And she's left at a place where her mind is just scrambled now, because she knows if she goes out without this evidence and starts telling people that she really is a crisis actor and that these government agents broke into her house and stole the evidence, it's going to make her look even more like a lunatic.
And that's exactly the point. Ruby explains this to Cole, that's exactly the point. If she goes forward and tries to say all this stuff and has no evidence, people will just think she's crazy.
Yeah.
And so that's why they've deprived her of her research materials and the flash drive and the video and all that, is because they don't want her to have any evidence, because, nobody's going to listen to her when she pops up and says all this stuff without the proof.
That's right. So their solution for the guys on the tarmac was just to kill them. Their solution for her is to completely marginalize her if she decides to come forward. At least it spares her life, I guess. But that is where black and white becomes such an ironic.
Well, and not much of a life, because we see her like getting on one of these message boards and typing out some elaborate message about the hoax, and she recognizes that it seems completely insane. And the last time we see her, she's alone in her house screaming. I think the line is, nobody heard her. And she's alone in her house screaming. It's awful.
Yeah.
And, but then we see the discussion that Cole and Ruby have. Cole says, well, what if her son had been manifested back to life? And Ruby says, it wouldn't have worked out. He might have been, the conspiracy might have had him getting killed somewhere else. It wouldn't have worked out. It would have been no need to do that. And Cole says, we just basically killed her son a second time. And Ruby says, it's a dirty job.
Yeah. She has spent more time than Cole has justifying this stuff to herself, and he still can't. But yet, and this was something I was pointing about the character of Cole earlier on, he can't justify this stuff to himself yet, but he's standing there with Ruby. He's in this woman's house. He's going right along with it all.
Yeah, he has qualms, but the qualms don't compel him to do anything other than what Ruby is telling him they should do. And she tells him, what we do is ugly, because people can be ugly and they can believe terrible, ugly things. And it's sort of the ends here justify whatever means we undertake. And we are protecting the world from this stuff. But, we see here that even the Department of Truth, what they do has real human cost to it. And whatever the purpose of this was, that it's definitely left this woman, I guess, in even a worse place than she was, which was pretty dire to start with.
Yeah, that's right. When you said earlier, we're getting into the best part of the book, this was the most hard-hitting part of the narrative.
I mean, to me, there was some real genuine pathos to this. I mean, you see this in these, what's happened to this woman is so awful. You have a real, unless you're just a completely unfeeling, horrible person, I think you can't help but have tremendous amount of empathy and sympathy for this woman and what's happened to her. You'd feel bad for her based simply upon the fact that her son was murdered in that way. But then when you see the added psychic cost of that and the inundation that she's faced from people pushing these conspiracy theories and the horrors that she's undergone for however long it's been since her son was killed, it's really affecting to me. And that to me was why I thought this was the best part of it, is because the stakes here really are the highest, at least, in terms of, I know that we're talking about in the other parts, these sort of global stakes, the reality of the world and, the end of the world, not just a physical place, but this could be the end of the world. What if these things manifest and our entire understanding of things is shaped up? But this is a real human cost, and at a small scale level, talking about one person. But seeing that one person and seeing how badly she's affected and how much she's harmed by people pushing these conspiracy theories, I think really puts a real human cost on this stuff in a way that some of the other chapters don't really do as much. And I think it really it sits sort of perfectly, I think, in the middle of these, the 5 chapters that we have in this book. This one's right in the middle. And it to me, it is kind of the heart of it, is because it shows you the cost of this stuff, while at the same time sort of introducing this notion that the Department of Truth maybe isn't the wholesome actor that you would want to believe that it is, and that even when they are doing their job in a way that maybe is good on a large scale basis, there's collateral damage to that. And it makes you start to think, and I think it's a good lead into the stuff that follows. Next, we see that mission affecting Cole.
Yeah.
And we see what he is made to do through that, and the fact that it has real costs for him as well. So that really, to me, sort of perfectly positioned in the narrative there to sort of push us forward while really communicating something important about these conspiracy theories.
Yeah. Just because the antagonist organization is called the Black Hat don't mean that these guys are wearing the white hat.
Yeah. Or that everybody involved, that there is, that it is black and white, and that it is binary, that there's good and there's evil, that it may be that everybody's bad in some form or fashion. And so now I think we're introduced to the concept here that there may be some questionable aspects to the Department of Truth.
Yeah. Well, let's move into issue 4. And this one is called The Eyes in the Walls. So we've got our Department of Truth crew here. And this time that consists of Director Lee Harvey Oswald, Cole, and that tech that we referred to earlier, who, I'm sure she's an adult, but looks like a surly teenage girl.
She's sassy.
She is a little sassy. And they're in one apartment that's just got like this wall of monitors. On it, they are watching these 2 men who are mostly in shadow that are having a conversation. It turns out those 2 men are having the conversation literally on the other side of the wall in the next apartment, where there are microphones and cameras hidden all over the place. And the 2 men who are speaking are a writer for the Post and an editor that writer works with. And the writer is totally freaked out because he's come into possession of some evidence that he doesn't exactly know what to do with. And the editor is trying to sort of rein him in and calm him down a little bit, and also trying to tell him, like, you are acting nuts. I can't have you acting nuts. So let's break it down. A lot of this issue, and by the way, we discover that the evidence that this reporter has come to him in a series of envelopes with a black hat on them. Over the course of time that he's received all these envelopes, he has obtained all these documents that lay out this conspiratorial-minded history of the United States going back to Allen Dulles as the director of the CIA in 1961, there's a memo where he's ordering the destruction of a Kenyan birth certificate and the creation of a Hawaiian birth certificate for a young man named Barack Obama. And then leading in through the Kennedy assassination, and George H.W. Bush gets involved. And all this evidence would lead you to believe that all of these conspiracy theories over the years are true, and that the Kennedy wasn't pliable enough, and so he had to be taken out. And the Bush family and the Clinton family were selected from early on and handpicked by the deep state to be propped up as these leaders, ultimately leading up to Barack Obama being elected president.
Well, we actually see in those documents the creation of the deep state.
That's right.
It's in the Warren Commission minutes.
Okay. We've all been waiting for those Warren Commission files.
Yeah, the Warren Commission apparently decreed the creation of the deep state.
So the reporter is talking to the editor about what he's going to do with this information, because he says he's sort of put the pieces together that that this stuff is bunk, that whatever he's receiving from the Black Hat, it might be real, but it's not reality. And he sort of, I think, has caught on to the idea, too, that if he publishes all this information, and which he has his own concerns about whether anybody's even ever going to publish it, or it'll make him look like a lunatic if he does. But if he ever publishes this information and people do start to believe it, he's got the idea that it's going to sort of tip reality in some way. But what he's also figured out is if it means that there is, we'll call it the left hand of this argument, there must also be a right hand of this argument. And that's when he tells his editor, I have no intention of publishing this material, but I want to know who is the other side of this. And he says to the editor, we're surrounded by cameras and microphones all over this room, like 100 of them right now. And the people who planted those are in the very next room, and we need to go confront them. He's put a whole lot together by himself, this writer has.
I thought that was kind of interesting because there's a scene in there where he says, hey, I recognized I got this series of 12 envelopes. They've got these documents in them that sort of lay out this comprehensive alternative history of the United States since the early 1960s and this sort of painstaking creation of the United States and its history over the past half century plus, starting with Alan Dulles, the big bugaboo, apparently selecting this Kenyan baby in 1961 to be groomed over the next nearly 50 years to become president. But then the guy says, I realize that this stuff fits together too easily, that that, all the pieces are just too neatly fit together. That can't be true. It reminded me of something that I had seen at one point. It may have been like some magazine article, like in Scientific American or something, talking about sometimes people who believe in conspiracy theories go so far overboard into it that they actually need mental health treatment for it. Like it becomes a dysfunction. It's not just something that they do as sort of a cute hobby. It becomes something that is actually affecting the way their lives go, and it becomes something for which they need treatment. And what this article talked about was the fact that the things that were most effective in terms of getting people to stop thinking of everything in this conspiratorial mindset were any sort of treatment interventions that taught them how to take a more analytical mindset to assessing things that they're presented with, and to improve their critical thinking skills.
Okay.
And so, of course, the flip side of that is that if that is a treatment for people who are deep into conspiracies, obviously people who are deep into conspiracies lack analytical thinking ability and lack critical thinking skills, which is funny in itself because so much conspiracy theorizing is built around this notion that people who are into conspiracies have that, actually...
They're the ones who really understand.
I know the way the world works. Mm-hmm. I'm not eating that spoon-fed stuff you get from the mainstream media and the official sources and all that. I understand the world, but in fact, it's the opposite. They actually don't understand the world.
Yeah.
And that I kind of think of it in terms of, it's like a gullible cynicism.
Oh, yeah.
That these people believe the dumbest stuff you could possibly imagine, but at the same time they're very cynical about, everything's set up to cheat you. It's a lie. It's not true. You can't believe it. But this guy gets exposed to all this stuff that would set these conspiracy theorists ablaze, and he's able to. He's a journalist. He's somebody who's applying critical thinking skills to it, and he just looks at it and says, "This can't be true. It's too neat. This isn't the way the world actually works."
Yeah.
And he's able to apply those skills and see that. And I thought that was kind of an interesting juxtaposition with people who buy conspiracy theories. When you think about like the Alex Jones type people we saw in the third issue where, they just believe the craziest stuff that some guy is red-facedly spewing at them. And but this guy is presented with this stuff, and he's adept and adroit enough to say, this can't be right. There's something fishy going on with this.
But also, in disbelieving that evidence, he comes to believe this thing that we would, once we step away from these microphones, would say is a crazy idea, that reality can be affected, and even affected retroactively by belief manifesting the conspiracies to come true, which is itself really funny.
Yeah.
That he comes to that conclusion.
Well, which of course is what Lee Harvey Oswald says the entire point of Black Hat sending them this stuff was. The point is to try to expose the Department of Truth. And it's not entirely clear to me exactly how the guy makes that connection, but he does make this connection in that there's something else out there. Like you said, there's a right hand for that left hand. And so, this was the entire point, was to get that guy to sort of work him into this realization that would have ultimately end up with the Department of Truth, this hyper secret government organization, getting exposed publicly, which we can't have.
Right. Which is, if something like that were to happen, would be like a conspiracy theorist dream come true.
Yes.
Which is funny in its own way.
Well, and he of course would have had no more proof than any of those conspiracy theorists ever have of anything.
Yeah.
He had no proof. He had a bunch of documents that he himself believed were fake.
Yep.
What else would he have had other than his intuition?
Yeah, you're right. And so his conclusion is the thing that he has to do is to go confront these guys in the next room. Although he's even saying out loud, like, I'm not going to expose them to the world. I think there's some sense in which he thinks that what they do is important in a way. And then there's another sense in which maybe he knows the futility of that kind of effort, but he needs to know for himself. And so while he and the editor are preparing to go next door and speak to the Department of Truth people, Oswald is saying to Cole, this is your moment to shine, buddy boy, because these guys are going to come into this room and you're going to answer the door and I'm going to fade into the shadows and it's going to be your job to kill them both, because no matter what happens, if they let some of this information out, they're credible enough of sources that this is the kind of thing we have to stomp on. And sure enough, that's what occurs over the next couple of pages. So these guys go over and they knock on the door. Cole answers and welcomes them in. They are distracted by this giant wall of televisions that's showing a live video feed of everything that's going on in the next room, just like the writer suspected. And the writer is saying to Cole, hey, look, what are you guys? NSA, CIA? And, Cole answers, well, something else. And the guy says, look, at the end of the day, I agree with you guys. I don't want any of this story to run. I don't even want to know who you are. I just want to know, and he gets to the point where he says, you're the good guys, right?
I think so.
Yeah, and we turn to the last page. It's that great last page reveal. We turn the page, and there's Cole, and he's standing there, and he's crying. He's got tears running down his face, and he says, I think so. And he's got a gun pointed at these guys, and then we just see the sound effects, bang, bang, and that's the end of the issue.
Yeah. Are you the good guys? I think so.
Yeah.
And so drives home again that point that the Department of Truth is a little ambiguous in terms of whether it is good or bad or something in between.
Yeah. A necessary evil, but evil all the same.
Yeah. Certainly. I mean, again, I think it comes back to the Ruby and Oswald definitely are people who believe that the ends justify whatever means they take to get there. And, no matter what they choose to do, so long as it's in service of their view of what this organization's objective is, it's fine. Whether that's torturing this poor woman in Connecticut about her son and, and sending her into hysterics, or whether it's killing these two guys from the Post. If it serves their objective, it's fine to do it. Yeah. And so kind of I guess it leaves us to question, well, is that right?
Yeah. And issue 4 really spills into issue 5, the way we don't have that same kind of break like we had with some of the earlier chapters. And this 5th issue is called The Shadow Play. And we've got Ruby going on a separate mission. She breaks into these empty offices that are beneath the Denver International Airport. And so let me stop here. First of all, I love the Denver airport.
It's a great airport.
It's awesome.
It's got these big concourses. There's plenty of shops and restaurants and everything.
Great seating,
it's
plenty
comfortable.
of plugs.
The only thing that's bad about the Denver airport is when you're trying to get there from Denver because it's like 30 miles away.
Okay, true. For me, it's usually been a stopover, but yeah, I suppose you're right.
I tried to get there one time in a snowstorm. I was taking a deposition in Denver of an expert, and I look out the window while it's a Friday morning. I look out the window while we're taking the deposition, and I see these huge flakes of snow falling. I'm like, oh God. Like, because, being from Little Rock,
Right.
The first sign, like 3 snowflakes shuts everything down. You're not going to get to the airport. You're not going to fly out of the airport. You are done for. And so I'm thinking, okay, well, I'm in so much trouble now. I'm going to get stuck in Denver. I'm going to be here all weekend. It's going to be terrible. So I, get to the end of the deposition. I say to this guy whose deposition I was taking, he's an expert witness. He's an accountant. I say, hey, how hard is it going to be to get to the airport with that snow? He's like, that's not going to be any kind of a problem at all.
That's not snow.
He's like, I'll take you. There's a hotel right down the street where you can get a cab from there, and they'll get you there with no problem. And of course, they did, and it was no issue at all. But it took forever to get there, and it just felt like, just when you're worried about, like, am I going to get out? Am I going to get home? You're just kind of like, it felt like it was forever, like it was 100 miles or something. But I know it's like maybe 20, 25, 30 miles.
Huh. But isn't there something, too, about the Denver airport, how it had this astronomical cost, where people wondered if there was something else going on because it was so expensive to build or expand or something like that?
Something like that. And I don't know the exact details, but I think it has been sort of a locus for conspiracy theorizing of some sort.
Sure.
There must be something else going on there. And apparently that's where Black Hat keeps their offices.
Yeah, it turns out apparently in the catacombs deep beneath the Denver International Airport, you have the HQ of the Black Hat, and Ruby has broken in there. But when she gets there, she realizes the Black Hat has already sort of decimated the place. They have destroyed all of their files. They've emptied the place out. She encounters a reptilian, like a reptile man, who the tinfoil hat guy who's on the other end of her, like communicator back in Washington, I guess, is saying like, oh, that reptilian is not even real. It's just a fiction that they left there to guard the place, which is kind of a funny thought. But then she discovers that this place is not abandoned. In fact, the Black Hat has slaughtered their entire staff, all the people who work for them, because they knew that Ruby was going to show up and infiltrate the place.
Sort of a rough way to shut down your office. I mean, like you tend to think of layoffs or anything that's, sort of nature being a terrible way to do people. But I mean, definitely better to get laid off than to just get slaughtered in the office, with videos left behind so that the people who discover you can go and look and see exactly how you were slaughtered there in the workplace.
Yeah, that's exactly right. She comes up to this computer and it has a little note that just says play me, and so she turns hits the button or whatever to turn the computer on. This video plays, and it's this head that appears on the screen.
It reminded me of Jor-El from like the Superman, like the first like Christopher Reeve Superman movie, where Jor-El's head sort of like appears in the Fortress of Solitude, and then when Superman's gonna fly around the world and reverse time so he can save Lois Lane, Jor-El's disembodied head appears before him in the sky, and it's forbidden for you to interfere in human history. That guy's head floating around in that panel looked an awful lot like Jor-El to me. Like it was just sort of this disembodied but giant head floating around.
Oh, that's great. And one of the things he tells her, though, is that there is one file that we didn't destroy. And she looks down and she finds this file that's got the Black Hat on it. It is the file on Cole Turner, and it talks about the star-faced man and all this stuff going all the way back to Cole's childhood. And Ruby panics, and she's like, I have to get back and find Cole immediately. So meanwhile, and it, I said issue 5 just kind of rolls right in from issue 4, and it might not seem like that as we went on this aside about the Denver airport and Ruby being there, and that didn't have anything to do with Cole. But just after Cole has murdered those 2 people from the Post, he goes back to his own apartment, and he is, he's crying. He throws up in the sink.
There's a scene in there between that, though, isn't there?
Oh, please.
Isn't there a scene where Cole's like trying to participate in the cleanup?
Oh, yeah, true.
And Lee Harvey Oswald says, you don't have to do that. We got people who do the cleanup. And he says something about, I'll tell you about your star-faced man. later. And then the next time we see Cole, he's upset and vomiting.
Yeah, that's right. He gets back to his apartment and throws up in the sink. He's seeing images in his mind of the two people that he's just killed. As he's alone in his apartment, or thinks he's alone in his apartment, there is a man sitting there. And that man says his name is Martin Baker, which wouldn't mean anything to anybody.
Oh, this reminds me of something.
Please.
So at the end of chapter 3, of issue 3, when we didn't talk about this, but we at the end of that, Ruby and Cole are leaving Mary's house after they've taken her evidence of the crisis actor stuff, and we see them having this conversation in the car. We see like the shot of Ruby's face. She's saying like, yeah, you ought to be scared of the black hat. And then we see right below it, there are two people watching them on like a hidden surveillance feed. They're watching Ruby and Cole have this conversation in the car.
Yes.
And it's the lady in the red dress.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a guy. And I think, and I can't be certain, but is it this guy who pops up in Cole's apartment in issue 5? Is it this Martin Baker guy?
It must be. And I just kind of blew past that. You're exactly right, though. I sort of clocked it when I was reading it, and then it didn't make it into my notes, and I had sort of forgotten by the time we're talking about it. But you're exactly right.
Because that's a cool thing at the end of issue 3, and I'm glad I remembered it, where you see this sort of Ruby as we see her when we are seeing the story unfold, and then immediately sort of juxtaposed with it is this shot that is clearly on some sort of a screen that these two people are watching, where they are watching Ruby and Cole have this conversation.
Yeah.
And so they clearly have some sort of surveillance equipment in the car that Ruby and Cole are riding in.
Great point, yes.
And I couldn't be certain, but it seemed like this guy is the guy who was sitting with the red dress lady.
I think
watching them as they were leaving Mary's house.
I think you are correct. So this guy introduces himself as Martin Baker, and of course he says, look, that I'm just telling you that name to be polite. You know, it doesn't mean anything to anybody. What you know me as is the head of the Black Hat.
Lee Harvey Oswald has his own name for the guy, but I won't say it because I promised I wouldn't curse on the podcast and affect your clean rating.
Yeah, you did, and I want to say I didn't ask you to, but you came in and volunteered.
I volunteered because I want to keep it clean. I wanted to do this on the up and up.
Well, I'm very proud of you. And, you know, Tynion is somebody who likes to lace a lot of profanity through his dialogue usually, too, and this book is no exception. But I'm very proud of you, Gary. Remind me to pat you on the head as
I've got like 2 hours without using the F word even one time, which is maybe a record, so I'm doing great.
Well, excellent. So as we continue on, we see this conversation take place. I'm just going to call him the Black Hat. It doesn't make any sense to call him Martin Baker. So the Black Hat is telling Cole, I've been watching you your whole life. I know all about your background with the Star-Faced Man, and I want you to be on our side. And he's trying to convince Cole of the fact that there is a right and a wrong side of this, eternal power struggle. And it's not the side that you think is the right side, but really those of us in the Black Hat. He lays out this idea, which I'm going to say right now is not entirely wrong as an idea. He lays out this idea that the Department of Truth, it sort of served its purpose back in the Communist Red Scare. And Lee Harvey Oswald felt like, okay, if we took care of the hysteria of that era, we are going to lose power now. And it's sort of this argument that people in power always want to retain that power. And so the Department of Truth, had to, if not themselves cook up, at least stoke the flames of the satanic panic in the 1980s. And the Department of Truth, is really the organization that is responsible for all that misery that Cole suffered and the terror of the Star-Faced Man, because it was a play for them to have an ongoing purpose and maintain power. And that's a compelling argument. Gary finds it less compelling than I do.
Yeah, I mean, if you accept some of the premises, I guess, that they were worried. I don't know that the timing really matches up, was the first thing I thought about that, is because he says, well, when the communists were going out, Lee, your buddy Lee was worried about not having a boogeyman out there, so he cooked up the satanic panic. But the Satanic Panic stuff was supposed to have been in the 80s, like early to mid 80s.
It's like 25 years later.
Right. The communist stuff is, the communists are still around to use as a boogeyman at least until the late 80s, early 90s.
Oh, yeah.
So it doesn't really match up all that well.
Oh, that's interesting. See, I was thinking of it more as like McCarthyism, which really sort of predates that prior theory about Allen Dulles in 1961. So you're right. There is a little bit of
and plus the fact, too, that in those 12 documents, that were presented to the journalist, one of them was this directive that came out at some point in 1990 to George H.W. Bush, who was president at the time, to create this new enemy in the Middle East to replace the communists. So these conspiracy theories maybe a little bit in conflict, but maybe Baker's telling us the real straight dope while all that other stuff was just made up to try to trick that journalist. It's hard to say.
Gary, I don't even know what to believe anymore.
I'm finding myself questioning the underpinnings of my existence.
Is any of this real?
Who could say? We may not be real.
Well, we're really going to be on the internet with this episode. And tell your friends, tell your loved ones. They got to get out and listen to that graphic novel Apostle. This is the good stuff right here.
I was disappointed that, if you listen to the podcast, the intro promises priestly garments. There's an illustration with a Batman type cowl. You're not wearing any of that.
You're not. Look, this is an audio podcast. We don't have. And by the way, I edit this thing, so that's getting cut out. Because I think by the time I go to a comic book convention and I'm super well known, I'm internationally famous now, I'll have to have my costume all together.
I was expecting a little bit more. I mean, you're wearing a polo shirt like the guys at the Flat Earth Conference. So, I was a little disappointed. It's a little bit of false advertising, but I'm willing to overlook it.
Gary, the real reason why I brought you here is I have some theories about the shape of the Earth and the maps, and so I'm glad you've come. Once we wrap up, we'll talk about that, though. So Cole ultimately rejects this idea. He is not being persuaded, I guess like I was, to join the Black Hat.
Well, there's a piece in there before we get to that point where Baker's laying out this whole theory to him. He's like, well, there's like 6% of the Earth of the people in America believe that the Earth is flat. And then he says something that to me just doesn't follow from that. He says, when it comes to the truth, majority rules.
It's a small majority, isn't it?
It's like you are defining majority in a really interesting way there, Martin. But he posits this notion that if enough people believe something, then that ought to be what the truth is.
Yeah, smooth talker here, this Baker.
But a little worrying because to put that back into what Ruby told Cole when they were leaving Mary's house, that hey, this is an ugly job because people believe ugly things and we have to combat it. And, the idea that if that's true, if the majority rules and they get to determine what the truth is, that could go into some fairly frightening directions. A strictly majoritarian approach to politics is something that, gets people worked up. And, we see there's so much political philosophy about the horrors of majoritarian excess. And now we're taking this majoritarian approach to the very concept of reality and what is true. And it seemed like Cole sort of recoils at that could be, because he says, people could get hurt.
Yeah.
And of course, and then Baker's pat response to that is like, well, you're racking up quite a body count yourself there, aren't you, buddy boy?
Doggone. Man, there's layers to this stuff.
It's good stuff.
Yeah. So ultimately, Cole is going to spurn Baker's advances here in terms of joining the Black Hat. And so Baker turns and he walks out of the apartment through a door that doesn't actually exist.
Right as Ruby's arriving.
And yeah, that's one of those fiction things. Ruby comes in through the door and she's all in a panic because she knows that she's got to get here because the Black Hat is going to be trying to recruit Cole.
Yeah. I mean, that notion that Baker walked out through a room that doesn't have an exit sort of made me wonder to some degree, was he actually even there? He shows up when Cole's very upset.
Yeah.
Cole's he's upset, he's vomiting, he's just killed 2 people. And you sort of wonder, like, I mean, of course, Baker's a shadowy figure. He probably does have ways in and out of rooms that wouldn't be available to other people. But it did make me sort of wonder a little bit if he was actually even there. But I, that.
Well, we've spent the last 2 hours questioning the nature of reality. And, when we talked about the art in this book, the way it's drawn artistically, it's supposed to cause you to question what you're seeing on the page. And so, yeah, why not? Why couldn't this be some figment of Cole's imagination?
But on the other side of that, Ruby doesn't doubt it at all.
No, that's right.
And so she is not, she truly believes that Cole has seen this guy, and she's not taken aback at all by the notion that he could conjure a way to escape from that room. So
yeah,
it's one of it's somewhat ambiguous as to where it is, but I guess you kind of have to go forward believing that it did happen.
And as Ruby comes in and she starts to talk to Cole, she's put the pieces together too, that really Black Hat, and I'll say the Department of Truth, but really the Department of Truth as expressed by Lee Harvey Oswald, has been manipulating Cole his entire life, from the time he was a little kid all the way up to this point. And Cole is realizing that too, and he's he's literally doubled over. I think he's sick basically, and he's saying, "But why me?"
Well, because Ruby tells him, like, they've been watching you your whole life, and they are also trying to recruit you.
Yeah,
and Lee Harvey Oswald wanted to beat them to the punch. He wanted to get you first, and Cole says, "Why me?"
And Ruby answers, and this is in the very last panel of the volume, "I don't really know, Cole. I don't really know." And we have the view from outside of the apartment, the woman in red just looking up at the apartment, observing this conversation going on.
With her back to us as the viewer, she's holding her sunglasses in her hands behind her back, and she's observing. And I take it from the way the speech bubble is there that she can hear what they're saying.
That's right.
It certainly suggests that she does.
Yeah.
And has been thus privy to the entire conversation. And
that's the end of Volume 1. We have a whole lot of questions that never got answered in this volume.
No, for sure. And that's why, you talked about earlier that after I read this, I bought this large compendium or whatever you call it.
The omnibus.
Omnibus. And that was why, because I got to the end of this, I was like, I want to know what happens next. And, to that degree, I mean, it definitely worked, and it hooked me and wanted me to made me want to figure out what comes next.
Yeah. Gary, part of the reason that I wanted to do this podcast was, aside from, and as I've said over and over again on this show, how much I like just talking about these books because I love the story so much. Another huge aspect for me has been having a conjured up reason to sit down with some of my favorite people and just talk to them in a focused way for 2 straight hours. And, I said earlier that, like, really the first 10 years of my career, we had lunch together, 3, 4, sometimes 5 days a week, often at the same restaurant. And, when Garrett was born, my life changed a little bit. I went part-time for a while, and then I worked in offices that just physically weren't quite as close. I mean, we're not more than a mile away from one another. Yeah. But as it is, we don't get together unless we really make a plan to. It used to be that I'd call over to your office and your assistant would pick up and she'd be like, "Hey, Mark, Gary is just in the other room. He'll call you as soon as he gets back." If it was around lunchtime. And man, you're one of my favorite friends. I'm so happy that we got to sit down and do this. So, man, you did me an honor by doing this. Thank you.
It was so much fun. And, that is, like you said, that is a lot of fun to get together and to talk about something that we've read in kind of a focused way. And, and I told you earlier, I think that this is really the first time for me that I've sat down with anybody and talked about something that I've read in sort of a systematic way since I left grad school. And I've been out of grad school now for 24 years.
Yeah.
So, more than half my life ago. And I haven't really had an opportunity to do that since. And it's fun. And it's one of the things that I really enjoyed about doing academic work was that you got to go to these classes and you were in these small classrooms with 10 or 12 people, and they were all very smart, and you got to hear what they had to say about the things you read, and you get to, you read the same thing and you have such different reactions to it and such different thoughts. And it was cool to do that here and to read this alongside you and then to talk about it and, different viewpoints on things, different things that we notice, things that we like. That's a real fun experience. And I appreciate you inviting me on and having me on. It's fun.
Man, thank you so much. And we'll plan on doing this again sometime, whether or not it's with the Department of Truth or, I know you've got an affinity for Southern California. I've got some great crime detective kind of stories based in a sun-drenched Southern California that I think you'd really get into. We'll have you back on. And everybody else, thank you for listening. Thank you for being with us. Please join us again next Monday. If you've got thoughts that you want to share on this book or on the show or on another book you'd like to see us do, hit me up. Instagram @GraphicNovelApostle or on email graphicnovelapostle@gmail.com. And keep reading those comics.